I'm Brother Francisco Whitaker, and I am one of the members of the vocation team here at St. Vincent Archabbey. Shortly after I became a monk, Father Nathan gave a talk to the monastic community about what it was like being a monk and living with ALS. It was one of the best talks that I have heard since joining the monastery. Through the talk, I learned what it means to truly suffer with Christ and embrace the cross. Being so inspired by his talk, I wanted to have Father Nathan give a similar talk to our vocation guests at one of our Come and See retreats. What you are about to see is a recording of this talk. But before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about Father Nathan. Father Nathan James Munsch, the Order of St. Benedict, was born August 19th, 1951, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Thomas J. Munsch and Margaret A. McKeon Munsch. The family home was in Glenshaw in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. He is one of 9 children, his siblings being Margaret Cronin of Basking Ridge, New Jersey, Thomas Munsch of Sammamish, Washington, Robert Munsch of Gloof, Ontario, Richard Munsch of Sewickley, William Munsch of Franklin Township, John Munsch of Greensburg, and Catherine DeSimone of Pittsburgh, and the late Mary Munsch. His brother, Robert Munsch, is a well-known author of children's stories, including the famous Love You Forever. Father Nathan is a 1969 graduate of North Catholic High School, Pittsburgh, where he was taught by the Marianist Brothers. He continued to be affiliated with the Marianist lay community, a Solidi, for many years. In 1973, he graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a Bachelor of Arts in History. During a study abroad program, he came into contact with the Benedictines in France, which had a formative influence on his vocation. In 1976, he graduated from Duquesne University with a Master of Arts in Classical Languages, and subsequently taught high school for 3 years. In the summer of 1979, he left teaching and, traveling alone with backpack, embarked on an 8-month pilgrimage to Greece, Turkey, Israel, and Europe. In July of 1980, he entered Mount Savior Benedictine Monastery near Elmira, New York, where he made simple profession of vows on the Feast of the Presentation on February 2nd, 1982, and made solemn profession on August 9th, 1986. Mount Savior is a contemplative monastery with a farm, a guest house, a gift shop, and several craft shops. In 13 years at Mount Savior, Father Nathan served variously as a sacristan, librarian, translator, dairy and sheep farmer, woodcutter, cook, sub-prior, and novice master. From 1988 to 1991, he studied theology at the Catholic University of America, earning a Bachelor of Sacred Theology in 1991. In 1990, he was ordained to the diaconate at Mount Savior by Bishop William Kinnair of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, who was a college classmate of his father and a friend of the family. On June 29, 1991, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, he was ordained to the priesthood at Mount Savior by Bishop Matthew Clark of the Diocese of Rochester, New York. After returning to Mount Savior, Father Nathan began to feel an attraction to a more active form of monastic life. In 1993, Father Nathan came to St. Vincent Archabbey, and in 1996, officially transferred monastic stability to St. Vincent. At St. Vincent, he has served as a hospital chaplain, an instructor in religious studies at St. Vincent College, and a Latin teacher in St. Vincent Seminary. He also gave retreats in the St. Vincent Summer Retreat Program and taught in the summer program of catechetical formation in the Diocese of Harrisburg. In 2002, Father Nathan completed a doctorate in systematic theology at Boston College in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, after which he returned to full-time teaching at St. Vincent College. While in the Boston area, he was resident at St. Lawrence the Deacon Parish in Chestnut Hill, where he assisted with pastoral work. In the summer of 2004, he was named pastor of St. Benedict Parish in Marguerite, about 5 miles from Latrobe. In the fall of 2008, Father Nathan left St. Benedict's Parish as part of a reconfiguration process in the Diocese of Greensburg and returned to teaching at St. Vincent College and St. Vincent Seminary. In 2009, he was assigned as sacramental minister with pastoral responsibilities to 2 parishes, St. Michael's in West Salisbury and St. Mary's in Pocahontas, both in the Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown. In 2015, Father Nathan was named Director of Pastoral Formation at St. Vincent Seminary, where his contacts with local institutions proved very useful. In 2020, he was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, leading to his retirement from active ministry later that year. Following his retirement, former parishioners and friends established an endowment scholarship in his name for the support of undergraduate theology majors at St. Vincent College. Father Nathan is now a resident at the St. Vincent Infirmary, known for charging around campus in good weather on his large power chair, and also for his cheerful manner, for not complaining, and for being thankful for God's goodness, even while living with a difficult disease.
A little bit about this disease I have called ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. The ALS stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which of course means nothing to anybody except unless you're in the medical field. In the UK, they have, I think, a much better description. It's referred to as motor neuron disease because it affects motor neurons, or the nerves that connect to muscles and cause them to move. So they're called motor or motion neurons. Now, in most cases, about 90%, it first manifests itself in the extremities, which was my case. It characteristically starts on one side. So I started losing motor control or strength in my right foot and calf. But it was slow, and at first I thought, well, I'm getting old. But eventually, things started going wrong in my hands, and that was the key, because the only thing that connects the feet and the hands is the central nervous system. So one specialist finally got wise and said, you need a nerve conduction study. And the report came back and said, you probably have ALS, or a motor neuron disease. Now, a little bit about motor neurons. The first thing that got weak, or was my right big toe. Now, if you had to guess, how many neurons do you think the body has to string together to get from your brain to your big toe? 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, just ballpark figure. 5,000. Anybody else? 1,000, 5,000. The answer is 2. This was a great revelation to me. There was a bundle of nerves that's part of the spinal column. Your spinal column actually ends about 2/3 of the way down your backbone. Then there's this big bundle of nerves that continues. So there's this big bundle of nerves inside the spinal cord that comes down, but then branches out into individual motor neurons, nerve cells. And each of those individual nerve cells runs continuously without break out to a muscle somewhere. And actually, there are thousands of them that run to every individual muscle. And each one controls a little bundle of fibers called a fascicle. So from your 2/3 of the way down your spine out to your big toe, there is a single cell. I thought all cells were microscopic. This one is 3 to 4 feet long, or more if you're tall. That's one of the reasons why this disease is so terribly difficult to study. Because by the time they get a little bit away from the spinal column, those motor neurons are about 1/8 of the thickness of a human hair. So what's going on inside of them between your lower spine and the muscle is happening at the electrochemical molecular level. So the moment you take the thing out of the body, there's almost nothing there. What's going on inside the thing stops as soon as you take it outside the body, or as soon as the body dies. Or so with most other things like blood, bone, skin, tissue, organs, you can take them outside the body and study them. You can sort of make them work on their own artificially. When the way I discovered I had ALS was I came back that night. I came back and actually taught a class. It was the most difficult class to teach I'd ever taught. But I didn't really know what ALS was. So I bought a book, a digital book online called ALS, The Facts by the head of the ALS clinic in Oxford. And I thought, this guy must know what he's talking about. Read the first 70 pages, and by about 9:30 that night, I knew I had ALS. The official diagnosis didn't come till a month and a half later when I got all the tests done by the specialist. But I had all the symptoms. I'd actually had it about 2 years previous to diagnosis. And at that time, I was 67, just about to turn 68. And everybody in my family had been rather long-lived. My parents lived into their 90s. I liked being a monk, I liked being a priest, I liked being a teacher. So I had this future imagined out for me, being active for but at least another 10 years. Well, that whole future dissolved into nothing. I was going to slowly become paralyzed by this unpleasant disease to the point where I'd have to rely on other people simply to wash my body help me urinate and defecate. And that was not a pleasant prospect. So it's begun to affect the muscles used to control breathing. That's why I have to use this machine to push air into my lungs. There's nothing wrong with my lungs. But my diaphragm is slowly going on strike. That was the only time in my life where I experienced serious suicidal thoughts. Not in the sense that I thought I'm going to go buy a gun, but I just thought I would prefer not to be alive. I would prefer to die right now and get it over with. I don't feel like going through this. Though I got up and went to morning prayer the next day. One of the Psalms was Psalm 87, which is the only psalm. It's the only psalm in the Psalter which there's no expression of hope. I thought, maybe God's telling me something. Because it's also a complaint expressed to God, saying, God, why are you doing this? Though I took it to prayer and pretty quickly got the thing turned around. And one of the things that most was always stuck in my mind was I talked to a college friend of mine on the phone who called me when she heard through the grapevine that I had ALS. And she said, Nathan, but you need to remember one thing, which is that this illness of yours will be a blessing for many people. And I thought to myself, you're out of your mind. It's going to be a royal pain. She was right. She said people will enjoy taking care of you. And they will derive great benefit from the way that you will deal with the prospect of death with dignity and joy, because I know you, Nathan, that's just the way you will do it. No, I'm not quite so sure her confidence was entirely merited, but she was right. One of the great choices we face in life is the question about why is there something rather than nothing. So for 3 years, actually for 5 years, I've slowly been losing control of my body. I'm about to go through another transition where I will finally not be able to use a cell phone, which has been my key way to keep in touch with people and receive emails and texts. But I thought really long, hard, and serious about these questions, even before I came down with this disease. And I've read some things about cosmology, like things by a guy named John Hote at Georgetown, about the wild improbability of the universe that we live in. And that kind of thinking was actually started by an English physicist who's an atheist named Paul Davies, who wrote a book called God and the New Physics. Saying that the number of improbabilities you have to put together to end up with a planet like we have and a universe like we have is just wildly improbable. He wrote another book called The Improbable Universe. And he concluded it with an analogy that he said the likelihood of the current universe is like 1 over 10 to the like 60th power to 10 to the 40th power. But numbers like that don't mean anything unless you're a mathematician. So he said, think of it this way. If you take, he didn't use the Star Trek imagery, but it's easy to fit into his analogy. If you take Captain Kirk and have him drop off Lieutenant Commander Spock at one end of the universe, and Captain Kirk goes zipping across the universe to the far, far other end of the universe and gets outside and gets a rifle. And Spock holds up a postage stamp. And Kirk fires the rifle, and the bullet has to travel for 15 billion years. 15 billion years. The likelihood of a universe that supports life is about the same as the likelihood that Kirk will be able to hit the postage stamp. So whenever, as I slowly lose, as the motor neurons slowly die in my body, I think I've got a gift between being angry and bitter about this and making life unpleasant for myself and others. Or I can be supremely grateful that God gifted me with this phenomenal body and so many other wonderful, great things about my life, and a nerve cell that was 4.5 feet long that I never knew about out to my big toe. Now, I do a quick transition to the rule of St. Benedict. One of the sheets I gave you talks about lists someone named Evagrius of Pontus, who was an extremely gifted individual who became a monk. He could have had a career in the imperial government or bureaucracy at the capital, but instead he became a monk out in the arid, semi-arid desert in Egypt. And he wrote a bunch of stuff that was enormously influential. He got in trouble, and after he died, some parts of his ideas were condemned, which made his name kind of toxic. The result is you didn't hear it, but all sorts of people read him and quoted him used him without mentioning his name. Now, his thought, there was a guy who spoke both Latin and Greek named John Cashin, who spent time in Egypt. We were pretty sure knew Evagrius personally. But he left Egypt, came to Rome, and started writing in Latin about Evagrius's ideas. And a lot of other stuff. Wrote 2 books called The Conferences and the Institutes, which are the only books mentioned by name in the Rule of Benedict. But overall, Benedict is up to something very different than John Cashin. Evagrius came out with this idea that there are 8 kind of central issues in life that you need to deal with. if you're on the road to holiness. And he called them the 8 thoughts. In modern parlance, they would be called something like the 8 issues or the 8 dimensions of life. And for him, these things were not off on you do it or you don't. If you look down beneath, if you look down below, he really treated them sort of like 8 life issues. So gluttony was really the use of food. Greed was the problem of how to deal with use of possessions. Now, asthenia and sorrow are very psychologically complex ideas that we really don't have time to go into. But lust for him was not simply, was really the question of how do we live with being sexual creatures and dealing with sexual impulses, and so on and so forth. Now, both Evagrius and John Cassian were kind of optimistic about learning to deal with these issues. Cassian thought that the truly holy man would be so well balanced that really nothing would bother him or her. And technically, that's referred to as a asceticism of transformation. The object is to get a group of people together, men or women, and through God's grace, so he's always clear about that, enlist God's assistance, which is offered to us, to become really balanced, completely in equanimity all the time. Now, about the same time Cassian lived, there was another guy named Augusta the Hippo who lived. And Augustine has a bad press in some ways. Now, in some ways, he was more pessimistic, but he was also much more realistic. And he said, sorry, guys, human beings are not going to pull that off. We are just too broken to manage it. Sorry. Get over it. Now, there's a negative. Augustine goes off the deep end a little bit. It is some of his negative ideas. I think he got very depressed towards the end of his life. When he died in the city of Hippo, it was being besieged by a particularly nasty group of barbarians called the Vandals, who had worked their way across North Africa, killing and torturing to death a lot of his friends on the way. He lived at a tough time. Now, the positive side of it is that we need to be realistic about dealing with the fact that we're not perfect, and realistically speaking, we're not going to get there. So I really think the role of Benedict, this is my personal estimation, is in large part in working out on the practical level in community life of Augustine's insight that we don't reach perfection in this life. And that's technically called an asceticism of charity. We need to learn to put up with each other's weaknesses. The ALS for me was the final sort of education in getting over a certain kind of pride, which is that in thinking about monastic life and this notion that, well, we have to care for the weaknesses of others, I always tended to imagine myself as one of the strong, really together guys, taking care of all the weak brothers around me. Now, in some ways, that was very well intentioned. at times it could lapse into a kind of prideful thought that I'm going to put up with all these weak bastards and achieve holiness in the process for doing it. But this was the final step in coming to terms with the fact that we are all weak. We all need to take care of each other. All of us are in some ways weak, in some ways strong. And I'm going to end up being physically the weakest of the weak, quite literally. So, a little bit about our Western tradition. There was a guy named Pope St. Gregory the Great, about 200 years. Wait, I take it back about. Okay, he lived only 50 years after the death of Benedict. Wrote a little, sort of a biography of Benedict, or some stories about him in his work called the Moralia. By the time Gregory lived, Italy was really under the control of Germanic tribes. The peninsula had been devastated by a civil war. And most of the Latin-speaking, formerly Roman lands north of the Alps were also under the control of Germanic tribes. But instead of being a pessimist, his attitude was, we're going to convert these people. And the church did. All of the tribes that moved in were converted to Catholicism eventually. But one of Gregory's geniuses that could also be a fault was that he liked to simplify things for the purposes of teaching them. So he took Cassion's work called the Institutes, outlines these 7 principal areas, or 8 principal thoughts. Gregory took it and converted it into the list of the 7 deadly sins. And this had enormous effect on Western spirituality, particularly when regular confession became common. So the most common form of examination of conscience was going through the 7 deadly sins. In other words, did you do it or didn't you? Now, that can be a useful list in some ways, but it also can tend to lend itself to a sort of an off-on mentality. The question is like gluttony. Instead of thinking simply, how do I deal with the gift of food in my life? It's simply, did I overeat, yes or no? And all of these can sort of become a yes-no things. Like greed, did I buy too many things? I did not, fine. Lust simply became, did you have sex? Did you fornicate or commit adultery? Yes or no? I think it's much better to think of these things as life issues and devoting oneself. I think this goes for all Christians, particularly Catholics, devoting yourself to treating all of these things, dealing with all of these things as life issues in which we learn to use God's gifts properly and recognize that we're all imperfect in these areas. And to realize that God is with us in our suffering. That's been the key one for me. More and more, when I pray these days, I simply like to look at a crucifix and think that life is a gift that is absolutely astounding. It's has shortcomings that ends in death, which is a terrible shock and insult to us, but God is with us in that suffering. And to really tease that out is something that takes you work on in the course of a vocation. I was diagnosed 3 years ago in May of 2019. Though I'd clearly had symptoms 2 years previous to that. So ALS mimics a lot of things, and it's a very uncommon disease. At any one time, the likelihood that you will have it is about 1 in 20,000. Though average life expectancy is 3 to 5 years, so I've got the slow version. I've talked at any one time only about 20,000 people in the entire country have ALS. But the population, the people who have it, turns over roughly every 5 years. So in the course of a lifetime, the likelihood that you will know somebody who has ALS or somebody who knows somebody who has ALS is actually quite high. And most of the people I talk to say, oh, my cousin had it, my uncle had it, and they died in 6 months, or they died in 3 years. So, actually, that book I read, I was tempted to get angry at the doctors because they misdiagnosed it for 2 years. But then that guy from Oxford said, if someone has a version of ALS that gets misdiagnosed for several years, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it means that it's a fairly slow-acting form that first manifests itself in isolated symptoms that are easily mistaken for something else. And when it kind of shows up with a bang very quickly, people get diagnosed very quickly. They also die very quickly. So I'm not angry at the doctors. They were just doing their job. The likelihood, I mean, most doctors have dealt with, sometimes they've never dealt with an ALS patient. My family doctor I see here has dealt with 2 ALS patients in his entire career. I'm the 3rd. Here's a bit of a tangent. Way back in the 70s, when I was teaching high school, I ran into some nuns who I thought were splendid, wonderful people. But they also made me kind of sad in some ways, because they said, we don't know what we're doing in religious life. Yeah. I thought I wanted to teach, and the only way I could teach was to be a nun, so I became a nun, or a sister rather. But these days, young girls don't have to be nuns to teach. They can do all these other things. So I really don't know what I'm doing here. I'm middle-aged, I'm going to stay in it. But and I think the same sort of thing happened with a lot of men in male religious orders. Now, I understand that, but at the other level, I just always thought to myself, that's just very different than my experience of an attraction to religious life. There are some people in life who feel this strong attraction to be close to God. And I once read a series of books that said that this is a transcultural phenomenon. In primitive cultures, it's referred to as having a vision quest. I only read that kind of stuff years later when I was a Benedictine. But in a certain sense, I was startled that a lot of my behavior in life corresponded to this pattern that I had experienced fairly early in life that I interpreted as a very powerful presence of God in my life and a desire to pursue that presence. And in the course of doing that, I tend to sign up for religious retreats when they were offered in schools. I made a retreat at a Benedict monastery with a dairy farm on a 1,500-foot high ridge in New York. I visited a Trappist monastery at 7,000 feet high in the Rockies near Aspen, Colorado. I visited and made a retreat at a place called Christ in the Desert, which is really in the desert, north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. You drive 25 miles north of Santa Fe to this town, which consists of a gas station. And then they have a 7-mile private road, unpaved, back to Chama River Valley. I made a pilgrimage to Europe by myself with a backpack for 8 months. Visited a place in Greece called Mount Athos, where there are 30 Orthodox monasteries. Visited this place called Meteora in Greece, where there's these other spectacular monasteries. I went to Israel and the West Bank. I spent a night locked in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, sort of both praying but also dozing off and sleeping, about maybe 20 yards from the rock where they think Jesus Christ was crucified. Visited other holy sites on the Holy Land, several monasteries in Western Europe. Then came back and joined a monastery. Now, in a certain sense, the notion of what I would do was secondary. There was like a personal struggle to deal with my own shortcomings and weaknesses. Drive to continue that almost compulsion to become closer to God. Yeah, that's the central issue, question, or struggle in that a drive to become closer to God was dealing with the question of weakness, illness, suffering, gratitude, anger, and bitterness. Almost anything in life, we have a choice between reacting with bitterness, disappointment, and anger, or with gratitude, acceptance, and love. And this is not simply something you can control by pressing a button in your life. On on one level, anger is simply an emotional reaction that occurs to us. We don't control it. But anger can take possession of us in a way that can end up kind of poisoning our lives. And to ratchet that back and say, no, I will not let that happen. That's a struggle. We all have the experience of love, beauty, and wonder in our lives. And we can all push it aside and say, I'm too busy, it's wonderful, but I've got other things to do. But for me, as a Catholic Christian, the central part of that struggle is, do I accept Christ's invitation to be saved by faith in Him, and a faith that really transforms my own reactions to ones of love and gratitude, which is what He manifested in His life. Well, my own response to that is really sort of based on some stuff I read in Augusta, which was taught in a class, which made an enormous impression on me, which is that in the earlier part of his career, Augusta was fighting with a group called the Manichees, who believed in really a spiritual world which was good and a physical world which was evil. So for them, suffering was absolute, incontrovertible evidence that the physical world was created by an evil God, and suffering is indisputable proof of that. And Augustine said they've got it all wrong. He said that he distinguished between two types of evil. There is moral evil, and that is in fact evidence of a revolt against God, but it is a revolt against God on the part of the devil or on the part of us. But we are weak, finite creatures compared to God. And that ultimately God will triumph over that. It has triumphed over it as evidenced by the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now that's for moral evil. So dying of a disease is one thing. Being tortured by somebody, that's a whole different type of evil. He said most of what people call evil in the world is a privation of goodness. In other words, the night I discovered I had ALS, I was very angry and upset and semi-suicidal because I was being deprived of something. I was being deprived of my future as I had imagined it. Now, it was fairly easy for me to turn that around because I was 67, just about 68. I have led a wonderful, privileged life in many ways. So for me to get angry at God at age 60, I was past retirement age. I'm past the age at which most males in the world die. it didn't make sense to denigrate God because I was not going to get those extra 10 or 15 years. Now, but there are a lot of cases that are not easy, where people are, where something is taken away from them, their health. Taking things, lacking something that you want to be there is not moral evil, it's a privation. Now the question is why God allows this privation. And again, it comes down to that question, why is there something rather than nothing? You got all this phenomenal world, all these marvelous human creatures who also suffer. Well, that doesn't take away from the fact that they're still marvelous, wonderful, astounding creatures with the ability to care for each other in their suffering, and the ability to love and be grateful to God even in the midst of suffering. No, that's not a complete answer, but it's always the one that I give. There's a certain kind of secular response, which is that I'm not going to accept the world unless everything is perfect, unless everybody is a middle-class American, unless everybody can live in a way that will destroy the environment. No, I'm being sarcastic, but there's a certain kind of sometimes I ask people this question: Would you like to live in a world in which everything is perfect? There is no sickness, and you will live forever. In fact, would you really like to be immortal? Now, keep in mind, this obviates the need for children. If everybody's going to live forever, we can't really bring children into the world. Otherwise, it would get a bit crowded. Would you really just like this life to continue indefinitely, even if you were in perfect health? But remember, you can't retire either, because you don't get old and weak. I don't know, how would you answer that question? I mean, the experience of having children, as people say, is the greatest joy in their lives. Well, you can't do it unless we're mortal creatures who have, sexually generate children. So they're like the complete rejection of God, I think, is really kind of on that basis, is ultimately based on some very unrealistic way of looking at things. But it can look very good and Christian. In other words, I want a world in which everything is perfect. There's never any recessions. There's no decay, or I don't know, maybe the leaves are always in fall color. But the world is a dark. John Hope, in one of his books, said part of his proof for the existence of, or evidence, there's no proof for the existence of God, but there's evidence. He called it the existence of drama. We live in a dramatic world. It's a dramatic, heart-rending, exciting world. People find their children exciting in a positive and negative sense. But most of us like living in this world.